Next, I want to give an overview of the physical geography of Middle America, and I'm going to extend that to some extent into South America as well, because they do share a lot of things in common. We'll get into more detail about South America later, but let me just kind of highlight the types of environments that we find from Mexico on south. In northern Mexico, this is a relatively dry environment. So if you think about the border states with Mexico, Mexico borders Arizona, New Mexico, part of Southern California. These are pretty dry environments. And likewise, the northern part of Mexico is also very dry. However, as you go further south, you get into tropical environments. And that extends into South America, and especially here in what's called in the Amazon basin, where this is the Amazon rainforest here. But you do have tropical rainforests, or those types of environments, extending up into Middle America as well, and even into the islands. We will talk about this. We have a dry part of South America, and we'll talk about why that is. And as you go further south, you get into climates that are a little more like the United States, because you're kind of, latitude plays a big role in climate. And when you get to this point, you're so far south, you're kind of as far south as US and Canada are north. The other thing I want to highlight is just some of the physical features that Middle America, and even more so in South America, these are areas that are defined by changes in elevation. That you have a high plateau in northern Mexico that makes up most of the central part of Mexico. This is an extension of the Colorado Plateau in the United States. The high plateau where for example, the Grand Canyon is. That high elevation part of the interior west of the United States extends down into Mexico. This is called the Mexican Plateau. And you also have some mountain ranges as well. But especially about the middle of Mexico on south, you have active volcanic mountains that line the edges of Middle America. And then particularly, you have the Andes Mountains in South America. So you have this long set of volcanic mountains that extend from Mexico on south into South America. And one reason for that is because South America and much of Middle America is on the Pacific Ring of Fire that we've discussed before, an area of high tectonic activity, including volcanic activity. So here, this is showing active volcanoes. We have active volcanoes from about the middle of Mexico on south into Central America, and then on down through the Andes Mountains. And at those boundaries, at those plate boundaries, where one plate is moving against the other, what you have is a phenomenon known as subduction. So as the ocean tectonic plate is kind of jammed up against the land tectonic plate, the continental tectonic plate, the ocean crust is much denser, and so it's forced downward. And the downward motion of that plate creates the conditions for volcanic activity. And so along those tectonic plate boundaries, you have these long chains of volcanic mountains. So as it's going down, it's dragging seawater with it. Then this plate is melting, and then the heat of the water actually creates lava that will rise to the surface and create a volcano. Technically, it's magma underneath the ground, and when it rises and makes it to the exterior, it's lava. But that's little more than we need to worry about right now. So this is showing tectonic plate boundaries, and if you look here, this black one with the arrows, and it extends down through South America, that's called a convergent boundary, and that's where you have subduction happening. And that's also where you have volcanic activity and the creation of volcanic mountains. So in many parts of Middle America, Central America, you can, one feature you can see on the landscape are volcanic peaks. So I believe this is Mexico City, and you can see these volcanic peaks in the background. A little closer at Central America, this pattern extends into here as well, that we have high elevation areas over much of Central America. And so we have a range from low elevation areas up to high elevation areas. And this is one place where physical geography and cultural geography mix together, because we've talked about the factors that affect climates. One is latitude, and one other one is elevation. So with the change in elevation comes changing in the environment that's there, and changing in the types of things that you can grow there. So for example, in these tropical areas, at the bottom of the mountain, it's going to be very hot and tropical, but the environment is going to change as you go up in elevation. So here at the bottom, they're growing things like bananas, which is a tropical crop. But as you go up further, they're growing things like apples and wheat, which would be something more like what you would grow in Oregon or Washington rather than in a tropical environment. So this is called altitudinal zonation, where you have a change in elevation, which leads to a change in the type of agriculture that you can practice. And here's a figure from our book, and there's different terms, and we're going to go over these for these different zones. And so in Latin America, and these are going to be in Spanish, we'll talk about what they mean, you have these different altitude zones. So for example, at the very bottom, you have the tierra caliente, and caliente means warm or hot. So it's going to be hot and tropical at the base of the mountain because these are in tropical areas. But as you go upward, it's going to be cooler and cooler. So above that hot zone, you have the tierra templada, more of the temperate zone in between. And above that, you have the tierra fria, which is the cooler zone. Then above that, the tierra helada, which is the very cold zone. And then above that, you have these icy peaks, especially in really tall mountains like in the Andes. So let's go over those in one by one. Let's start with the bottom, the tierra caliente. Primarily, the agriculture here is limited to commercial or plantation agriculture. And what they're growing is hot tropical crops, primarily sugarcane and bananas. So you have these big companies that have these big, massive farms near the coastal, lower elevation areas where they produce massive amounts of bananas or sugarcane. Not so much subsistence agriculture. This is primarily commercial. And then commercial agriculture extends up into the next zone as well, but the crop is different. Rather than tropical crops, coffee is the primary plantation crop here. So again, these are commercial. This is, people aren't growing the coffee to drink it. They're growing it to export to your local coffee shop or what have you. But here in the Tierra Templada, the temperate zone, coffee is the primary crop here. Now, as we extend higher into the Tierra Fria, here we begin to see more subsistence agriculture. And part of the way that works is that many of the people who, especially indigenous people who have lived in, for over thousands of years, who practice subsistence agriculture have kind of been pushed out of those lower zones as big companies have gone in and kind of taken over or gotten concessions from governments or what have you. And so people have kind of been pushed up into the higher elevation zones where you don't have as much commercial activity. So these are the areas where you have more of subsistence agriculture happening, especially growing of corn or potatoes or other crops. Much of central Mexico is within this zone of the Tierra Fria, especially on that high plateau that we mentioned. Now, as we go further up, agriculture is very limited as far as growing crops. So most of the economic activity has to do with grazing. Now, these higher zones are going to be primarily in South America and the Andes Mountains, which are very tall. So, for example, you can have people can herd llamas at high elevation. So here, grazing is the primary food growing activity. And then above that, you get beyond even the grazing zone into the ice-covered peaks of the Tierra Nevada, sort of the mountainous zone. And so these are where you have the really tall mountains, you have these icy peaks on top, and that's the Tierra Nevada. So just to recap, you should be able to, I'll just tell you, you should be able to identify these zones on a figure like this that is unmarked. You should be able to identify which one is a tierra caliente, which one's a tierra templada, and so forth. In addition, you should be able to identify, for example, which one of these zones is primarily the coffee growing zone, which one of these zones is just snow and ice, which one is hot plantation crops, or which one is more subsistence agriculture. So make sure you are very familiar with this. This is going to be one of the more important things that we cover in this part of the course.